The Texas sun, a relentless forge of heat and dust, beat down on Elias Marrowick's weary frame. His horse, a gaunt roan named Jericho, plodded along the familiar parched trail, a long journey from the bustling trading post of San Antonio. It had been nearly a month since he left the family homestead, a place his brother Silas had carved out of the unforgiving landscape like a wound. The thought of home was a complicated mix of dread and duty. Elias wasn't a Marrowick in the way Silas was. He lacked his brother's raw ambition and the callous disregard for others that came with it. He found a quiet comfort in the rhythm of the trail, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of his brother's presence. As he crested a small rise, the sight of the cabin should have been a welcome one, but a strange stillness hung in the air. The usual chorus of livestock was absent. No smoke curled from the chimney, a strange sight in the cooling late afternoon air. A chilling premonition, a cold snake in the pit of his stomach, coiled tighter with every step. He dismounted and walked toward the front door, his hand instinctively going for the revolver holstered at his hip. The door was ajar, a small detail that felt like a scream in the profound quiet. He pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. The air inside was thick, stagnant, and heavy with a metallic, coppery scent, the scent of blood. His eyes, accustomed to the bright glare of the sun, adjusted to the gloom. The first thing he saw was the upturned chair, then the legs. 4 of them, swaying gently in the faint breeze from the open door. 4 pairs of boots, hanging just above the floor. His breath caught in his throat, a painful wheezing sound. Silas, his wife Eleanor, and their 2 sons Thomas and James were all there. 4 of them. 4 perfect nooses, fashioned from new rope, not the frayed old stuff from the barn. They were strung from the central support beam of the cabin. Their faces were a grotesque, puffy mess, their eyes wide and lifeless. It wasn't just a hanging. It was an exhibition, a twisted, macabre piece of art. The silence of the house became a roar in his ears, and the metallic scent filled his lungs. Elias stumbled back, the images burning behind his eyelids. He forced himself to look again, to see the details he had missed in his initial shock. No signs of a struggle, no broken furniture, no splinters of wood or overturned lamps. The scene was neat, orderly, almost respectful. The table had been set for a meal, 4 plates and a 5th empty one at the head. A gruesome punchline. His mind, reeling, scrambled for an explanation. A local quarrel? An Indian raid? But the lack of ransacking, the deliberate precision of the scene, spoke of something far more personal. As he looked around the room, his eyes caught on a small, intricate carving on the wooden mantelpiece. A figure he didn't recognize. Next to it, a small leather pouch, a familiar piece of his family's property. He opened it and found Silas's favorite hunting knife, the one with the bone handle. It was clean, polished, and laid out as if for display. And then he saw it. Scrawled across the floorboards in charcoal, a single word: Samuel. A cold dread replaced the shock. Samuel, the old slave, Silas's property since they were boys. Quiet, diligent, and utterly devoted in his servitude. Elias had always found a strange sense of companionship with the old man, a shared understanding of Silas's cruelties. But the word, stark and accusing, pointed to a different reality. The last time Elias had spoken to him, Samuel had said something strange. "The reckoning comes for those who have lived too long in the shadows, Master Elias." Elias had brushed it off as the ramblings of a tired man, but now the words echoed with a chilling, prophetic weight. He stumbled out of the cabin, gasping for air, the world spinning. He vomited into the dusty soil, the image of his brother and his family, swaying like marionettes, seared into his memory. The thought of Samuel, the gentle old man, committing such a heinous act felt impossible. Yet, the evidence on the floorboards was undeniable. He grabbed Jericho's reins, his hands shaking. He had to ride. He had to get to the nearest town, to the sheriff. The law must be brought to bear, a quick and final justice. But even as he spurred his horse into a frantic gallop, a tiny, gnawing doubt took root in his mind. The perfect scene, the deliberate lack of struggle, the strange placement of the knife. It was too neat, too much of a statement. It was a story laid out for him to read, and Elias knew that the simplest explanation was rarely the full truth in this unforgiving land. The real mystery was not who had done this, but why, and with what purpose. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and red, a fitting backdrop for the horror he had witnessed. He knew what the community would say, what they would believe. A slave, driven to madness, seeking vengeance. But Elias knew deep in his gut that the truth was far more twisted than that. He had to find Samuel before the law, or the posse, did. The hunt had begun, and Elias was not sure whether he was chasing a killer or a ghost. If you've made it this far, the mystery is just getting started. Subscribe to the channel to follow the Marrowick family's dark story to its shocking conclusion. Elias rode through the night, a frantic, desperate journey to the nearest settlement. The image of his family, strung up like scarecrows, was a constant, searing torment. The moon, a pale and indifferent eye, cast long, distorted shadows that danced along the trail, each one a phantom of the horror he had left behind. He pushed Jericho hard, the horse's labored breathing the only sound besides the thumping of Elias's own frantic heart. He reached the town of Redemption, a collection of ramshackle saloons and dusty stores just before dawn. The sheriff, a man named Jedediah Price, was a grizzled, no-nonsense sort with a face like a roadmap of bad decisions and hard living. He listened to Elias's breathless account, his expression unreadable, and then simply nodded, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon where the sun was beginning to bleed over the land. "We'll ride out at first light," Jedediah said, his voice a low gravel. "The men'll be riled up something fierce. A man's property is his lifeblood out here, and a slave turning on his master, well, that's a sickness they'll want to cut out quick." The posse that assembled was a grim, silent group. They were men Elias knew, and their faces were a mixture of outrage and a morbid fascination. They all held the same conviction. Samuel, the old family slave, was a monster in human skin. They saw no nuance, no reason beyond a simple, brutal act of rebellion. They rode back to the Marrowick homestead in grim silence, the rising sun illuminating the landscape in shades of gold and amber. When they reached the cabin, the scene was just as Elias had left it, the bodies still swaying in the morning air. A collective gasp, a low murmur of shock went through the posse. Jedediah, however, was a professional. He gave the scene a long, hard look, his eyes scanning the details Elias had already seen. "No signs of a fight," he muttered, shaking his head. "Clean as a whistle, no broken windows, no door kicked in. The feller walked right in." "He was their slave, Sheriff," Elias said, his voice raw. "He lived here. He had a key. It's Samuel. It has to be." But as the posse went about their grim work, taking the bodies down and preparing them for burial, Elias's doubts deepened. He watched them with a detached, clinical eye, trying to make sense of the chaos. He saw the new rope used for the nooses, a kind they never had on the ranch. Silas was a miser, a man who reused everything until it fell apart. He would never have bought new rope for a simple hanging. The carving on the mantelpiece bothered him too. It was a crude but distinct rendering of a serpent swallowing its own tail, a symbol Elias had never seen before. He also noticed that the boots on Thomas and James were missing, their feet bare. Why would a killer take their boots? It made no sense. Elias's gaze drifted to the small cabin where the slaves lived, a short walk from the main house. It was empty. Samuel was gone, and so was his younger brother, Jacob. Elias had always been kinder to them than Silas, often bringing them extra food or letting them rest when his brother wasn't looking. He remembered a conversation with Samuel a few weeks prior, a moment he now replayed with agonizing clarity. "Master Elias," Samuel had said, his voice a low rasp, his eyes weary but sharp, "the wickedness of a man's heart is like a weed. You can cut it down, but the roots, they always remain. They fester, and one day, they will grow into something you won't recognize. Elias had been taken aback by the uncharacteristic bitterness in Samuel's tone. He'd asked him what he meant. Samuel had just shaken his head. The Marrowick name, it's a heavy one to bear. A man's debts are not just to the bank, Master Elias. They are to the very soul of the land, to the people who walk upon it. Your brother, he has run up a powerful debt. At the time, Elias had thought Samuel was speaking in riddles, a simple observation about Silas's cruel ways. Now the words felt like a prophecy, a grim warning he had failed to heed. He walked over to the Marrowick's small, overgrown garden. The soil was loose, recently tilled. It wasn't the season for planting. He knelt, his fingers digging into the rich, dark earth. He found nothing, but the fresh tilling, a few yards from the cabin, was another detail that didn't fit. Why would a killer in such a rage take the time to do yard work? The posse had found tracks leading away from the homestead. They were fresh, and they belonged to a single horse. Not Samuel's old mule, but a fine stallion. Silas's stallion. A chill ran down Elias's spine. Samuel couldn't have ridden that horse. It was too wild, too spirited. Silas was the only one who could handle it. The killer had taken the fastest horse, not the most convenient. Jedediah, ever pragmatic, watched Elias's searching. "What are you looking for, son?" he asked. "You saw the name. The man's gone. That's all we need to know. He's probably halfway to Mexico by now." "No, Sheriff," Elias said, standing up, his hands covered in dirt. "Something's not right. The boots are gone. The new rope, the carving, the tilled earth. It's a performance, Jedediah. It's meant to look like Samuel did it, but it's too deliberate. It's not a crime of passion, it's a message." Jedediah scoffed. "A message? A man hangs his masters and that ain't a message? What are you saying, boy? You think it's someone else?" "I don't know who," Elias admitted. "But Samuel isn't just a simple man. He's smarter than people give him credit for. And this feels like someone else's handiwork, someone who wanted to make it look like a simple act of revenge, but couldn't help but leave their own mark." He turned to the sheriff, his eyes pleading. "Jedediah, you have to help me. We can't just go out there and hang the first man we find. We have to be sure." The sheriff looked at Elias, then at the silent, expectant faces of the posse. "Boy, in this territory, a man is guilty until proven innocent. Especially a man like Samuel." He spat on the ground. "But you're a Marrowick. You're family. So I'll give you a day. You can poke around. But after that, the posse rides. And when we find that slave, he's gonna swing. We don't need a trial for something this clear." Elias knew he had to act fast. He had to uncover the truth, not just to save Samuel, but to find out who was responsible for his family's grotesque end. As the posse prepared to ride out, their faces set in a grim determination, Elias watched them go, a powerful sense of urgency rising in his chest. He knew he was standing on the precipice of a dark abyss, that his family's history was far uglier than he ever imagined. The real terror was not the hanging, but the secrets that lay buried beneath the red Texas dirt, secrets that had finally risen to claim their due. With the posse riding hard toward the distant horizon, their minds fixed on a simple, bloody conclusion, Elias was left alone with the silent ghosts of the Marrowick homestead. He felt a deep sense of isolation, a stark divide between his desperate need for truth and the mob's thirst for simple justice. The sun, now high in the sky, seemed to mock the chilling atmosphere. He walked back into the cabin, a lantern in his hand to cut through the oppressive shadows. He started his search not as a man looking for a culprit, but as a man looking for a story his brother had kept buried. He began in Silas's study, a small, cluttered room smelling of stale tobacco and old paper. The desk was a chaotic mess of bills and half-written letters. He sifted through them, looking for any clue, any sign of a conflict that could explain the violence. Most were routine, but one letter caught his eye. It was from a bank in San Antonio, a stern, terse notice of foreclosure. The Marrowick homestead, it seemed, was on the brink of ruin. Silas, the man who flaunted his wealth and power, was deeply in debt. Elias's hands trembled as he read it. This was a powerful motive, a potential key. But a man in debt doesn't hang his family and himself. He just disappears. The foreclosure notice was dated a week before the murders. The killer, whoever he was, had known about Silas's financial ruin. He moved on to the town, a place called Redemption, a name now thick with a bitter irony. He sought out the town's oldest residents, the ones who had seen the Marrowick family rise from nothing. He went to the saloon, a place Silas would never be caught dead in, and found a grizzled old-timer named Jasper, his face etched with a lifetime of hard labor and cheap whiskey. "The Marrowicks?" Jasper said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice. "Silas Marrowick? Lord, that man was a powerful, mean son of a gun. Came here with nothing but a pair of torn boots and a fierce need to own everything he laid his eyes on." Elias bought him a drink. "Did he have enemies, Jasper, besides the usual sort?" Jasper's eyes, clouded with age, sharpened. "Enemies? Boy, that man had more enemies than fleas on a dog. But there was one that stood out, a feller named Callum McPherson. Silas cheated him out of a whole piece of land, a prime patch near the river. Said the title was fraudulent, but everyone knew it was a lie. Callum lost everything. Last I heard, he swore he'd see Silas pay for it, said he'd bring him down piece by piece, like a house of cards." Elias felt a jolt of recognition. The metaphor, the house of cards. It fit with Samuel's warning of a reckoning. He pressed Jasper for details on McPherson. "Left here years ago after his wife died," Jasper said. "Took his 2 boys with him. Said he was going west to work the mines. But he had a thirst for vengeance, that one. Said it would be a cold day in hell before he let Silas get away with it." Elias thanked him and left, his mind racing. He had another name, another motive, and a new layer of complexity. But McPherson's revenge seemed too simple, a direct confrontation. The scene at the homestead was anything but. It was subtle, psychological, and carefully orchestrated. His next stop was the mercantile store. The owner, a man named Bartholomew, was a nervous, portly figure who visibly recoiled at the sight of a Marrowick. "Elias," Bartholomew said, his voice a whisper, "what on earth happened out there? They say it was Samuel." "It's complicated," Elias said, leaning closer. "Bartholomew, did Silas have any unusual business dealings, things he kept quiet?" The merchant wrung his hands. "Well, I shouldn't. But Silas, he was a hard man to do business with. Always owed money, always haggling. But a few months ago, he started coming in with strange requests. He bought new rope, a whole coil of it, said it was for a new well. But he also bought something else, a large amount of charcoal. He said it was for branding cattle, but it was too much, and he bought it from me in secret at night. He said he didn't want the boys to know. Charcoal, the words scrawled on the floorboards. Elias's heart pounded in his chest. Silas had bought the very tool used to incriminate Samuel. But why? He continued his investigation, gathering fragments of a fractured story. A quiet, reserved man who had lost a daughter to a brutal illness on Silas's land. A young ranch hand Silas had accused of stealing and whipped mercilessly. A series of small, seemingly insignificant acts of cruelty that added up to a mountain of resentment. Silas had made enemies out of everyone, and not just by cheating them. He had done it through his sheer, unadulterated viciousness. As the sun began to set, casting long, menacing shadows across the dusty street, Elias realized he was no longer looking for a simple killer. He was looking for a pattern, for a design. The bodies were not the end of the story. They were the beginning. The Marrowick family had not been a pillar of the community. They had been a cancer. And now, the cancer had been excised, but the surgeon was still at large. He had to get back to the homestead. He had to dig. Not for clues, but for a hidden history. The tilled earth in the garden, the missing boots, the new rope, the charcoal, they were all pieces of a puzzle. A puzzle the killer had left for him specifically. They wanted him to find the truth, to see the wicked roots of his family's legacy. The terror of the hanging was giving way to a new kind of terror, a deep, unsettling dread that the monster wasn't some man driven to madness, but a cold, calculating intellect playing a long game. A game Elias had just joined. Elias returned to the homestead under the cover of a moonless night, the air thick with a foreboding silence. The cabin was a dark and lonely sentinel on the desolate landscape. He entered with a new sense of purpose, not as a grieving relative, but as a detective. The grotesque tableau of the hanging was gone, the bodies now in the ground, but their echo lingered in the stale air. He went directly to Silas's study, his lantern casting a small circle of light on the dusty floorboards. He knew there was more to find, something the sheriff and his posse had missed in their quick and biased assessment. He began with the desk, meticulously searching every drawer, every hidden compartment. He found a locked box, its brass tarnished with age. Silas, with his obsessive need for control, would have kept a key close. After a moment of searching, Elias found it, a small iron key hidden in the lining of a boot. The lock clicked open with a satisfying ancient sound. Inside, the box held not money or jewels, but a meticulously kept ledger. Elias's heart pounded as he opened it. This was not the chaotic mess of Silas's everyday life. This was the true record of his affairs. The ledger was a chronological chronicle of Silas's life in Texas, a record of every piece of land acquired, every debt incurred, and every person he had wronged. Elias read, his blood running cold. Silas was not just in debt to the bank. He had a web of private secret debts. He had borrowed heavily from a succession of investors, all with high interest rates and grim penalties for failure to pay. The names scrolled across the pages were familiar: ranchers, merchants, and even a powerful land speculator from Dallas. Elias saw the name Callum McPherson on the ledger, a line detailing a loan given, and then, in a different ink, a note. Settled. Title transferred to Silas Marrowick. This was not a loan. It was a theft, meticulously documented by the thief himself, but the most chilling entries were not of money. They were of people. Silas had a list of his former slaves, those who had worked for him and then, for one reason or another, had been sold or freed. Next to each name was a note: sold to, or ran off, reward paid to bounty hunter. Elias recognized one name, a young woman named Eliza. Next to her name, Silas had scrawled, sold to the Miller family. Her boy, too. A cold rage, not just from the brutality but from the casual way it was noted, settled in Elias's gut. He knew the Miller family. They were known for being particularly cruel. Then came the entry for Samuel. Samuel, loyal, useful, no debt. Elias snorted. Samuel owed him no debt because Silas saw him as a possession, not a person. But the ledger contained another, more recent entry under a different name. A name Elias didn't recognize. A.H. Loan to be repaid upon receipt of title for McPherson land. The initials were a mystery, but the amount was staggering. It was the last desperate act of a man trying to save his dying empire. Elias closed the ledger, his hands shaking. He had been so wrong. He had always seen Silas's cruelty as a simple character flaw. But it was a system, a machine of oppression, documented and refined over years. The Marrowick family wasn't just a family, it was a business built on theft, coercion, and human suffering. And now, the debt had come due. The tilled earth in the garden suddenly made sense. It wasn't a random act. It was a sign, a marker. Elias went back outside, his lantern held high. He knelt by the garden patch, a sense of dread settling over him. He started digging with his bare hands, the dry soil giving way with little resistance. After a few minutes, his fingers hit something hard. It was a small wooden chest, wrapped in oilcloth. He pulled it out, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, he found a small collection of artifacts, a silver locket, with a faded picture of a young woman he didn't recognize, a child's worn-out leather boot, and a small handwritten journal, its pages brittle with age. The journal belonged to Callum McPherson. The first few pages were a loving chronicle of his family's life on the land. Then came the bitter entries detailing Silas's betrayal, the fraudulent title, and their eviction. The final pages were filled with a grim, chilling resolve. "He thinks he has defeated me," Macpherson had written in a shaky hand. "He has taken my land and my pride. But a man who lives by the knife can be killed by the knife. He has a son, a quiet one, a gentle one. I will teach my sons a different kind of war, a slow, quiet war, and I will take from him what is most valuable to him. I will take his name." Elias stood up, the journal clutched in his hand, a new horror dawning on him. The mystery wasn't about who had killed the Marrowicks. It was about how. The answer lay in the intricate web of Silas's past, and it was far more sinister than a simple act of revenge. It was a meticulously planned, multi-generational plot to dismantle Silas's life, piece by piece. The killer wasn't driven by a sudden, violent rage. He was driven by a cold, calculating resolve, a hunger for retribution that had been festering for years. And he had used Samuel, a man of quiet dignity, as a tool, an unknowing instrument of a far more sinister plan. Elias knew now that he wasn't just chasing a killer, he was walking into a trap set for him, a final act in a play that had been cast decades ago. He had to find Samuel, he had to understand what had truly happened, because the real murderer, the true mastermind, was still out there. With the ledger and Macpherson's journal clutched in his saddlebag, Elias rode north, a new direction driven by a newfound urgency. His destination was Dallas, a bustling, burgeoning town far from the isolated, oppressive world of the homestead. The initials A.H. from Silas's ledger were his only lead. The name was common, but the profession, land speculator, pointed him to the city. The journey was a blur of dust and relentless heat. Elias rode with a grim determination, the weight of his family's dark history pressing down on him. He had known his brother was a hard man, a man of ruthless ambition, but the ledger revealed a level of calculated cruelty that sickened him. Silas didn't just take, he took with a cold, meticulous purpose, documenting every lie, every betrayal, as if it were a business transaction. Elias, who had always tried to distance himself from his brother's ruthless ways, now felt the stain of their family name clinging to him like a shroud. Upon reaching Dallas, a sprawling collection of new buildings and muddy streets, Elias was struck by the sheer energy of the place. It was a world away from the desolate silence of redemption. He began his search in the land office, a small crowded room filled with men poring over maps and ledgers. He asked about A.H. and was pointed to a well-known financier named Alistair Heatherton, a man with a reputation for both shrewdness and a certain ruthless efficiency. Elias found Heatherton's office on the main street, a clean, organized space that was a stark contrast to Silas's cluttered study. Heatherton was a man in his late 50s with a neatly trimmed beard and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail. Elias introduced himself and explained the situation, omitting the more gruesome details. Heatherton leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Marrowick. Yes, I remember Silas Marrowick. A man of singular ambition." He paused, his gaze fixed on Elias. "He was deeply in my debt. He came to me with a proposition. He wanted a large loan, a final bid to save his holdings. He offered a collateral that was unusual. He had a piece of land, a large tract, that was tied up in a legal dispute. He claimed he had a foolproof way to acquire the title. It was a gamble, but I've always been one for a good wager. The Macpherson land," Elias said, the words a cold statement of fact. Heatherton's eyebrows raised slightly. "You know of it? A thorny legal case, to be sure. Silas was convinced he could settle it. He promised me the title, and a great deal more once the land was officially his. He was quite desperate. He had a debt to pay, a debt he spoke of in hushed, terrified whispers." "What debt?" Elias asked, his heart thumping. Heatherton smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. "Not a financial one, Mr. Marrowick. a personal one. He was convinced someone was out to destroy him. He spoke of it as a ghost, a phantom that had been haunting him for years. He said his enemies were everywhere, that they had infiltrated his life, even his home. Elias felt a prickle of unease. "Did he give you a name?" "No," Heatherton said, his gaze unwavering. "But he mentioned something, a symbol, a serpent that eats its own tail." Elias felt the air leave his lungs, the carving on the mantelpiece, the image of the Ouroboros, an ancient symbol of cycles and self-destruction. It wasn't just a random carving, it was a signature, a message meant for Silas, and now for Elias. "Did he ever mention the name Samuel?" Elias asked, his voice a low whisper. "Samuel?" Heatherton looked genuinely puzzled. "No, never. He spoke only of a powerful, shadowy figure, a man who moved in the background pulling the strings. Silas was terrified. He thought this man was going to take everything from him. And in the end, it seems he was right." Elias thanked Heatherton and left, his mind a whirlwind of new information. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture they were forming was far more complex and terrifying than he could have imagined. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a long-term plan, a slow-burn revenge. The killer had meticulously studied Silas, had known his weaknesses and his secrets. The killer had to be someone who knew Silas intimately, someone who had suffered deeply at his hands. And then another piece clicked into place. The missing boots. Why would a killer take them? Not for a souvenir, but for a purpose. They were a sign of identity, of a life lived and ended. And they were a vital detail that the sheriff's posse, in their haste, had overlooked. As he rode out of Dallas, the setting sun painting the sky a violent red, Elias felt a new kind of fear. He wasn't just looking for a man who had killed his family. He was hunting a ghost, a person whose existence was woven into the fabric of the Marrowick family's legacy. The killer had left clues, a trail of breadcrumbs for Elias to follow. It was a chilling thought. The killer wanted Elias to know the truth. They wanted him to understand the depth of his family's wickedness, to witness the final bloody act of a long simmering revenge. The hunt for Samuel was now secondary. The real quarry was the mastermind, the one who had planned this gruesome act with such cold, calculating precision. Elias had to find the truth, not just for justice, but for his own sanity. The Marrowick name, a symbol of power and dominance, was now a curse, a stain that could only be washed away by the terrible, undeniable truth, and he was the only one left to find it. The posse, a grim and determined force of frontier justice, had pushed hard for 3 days, their horses caked in dust and their faces grim. They were driven by a singular purpose: to find Samuel, the runaway slave who they believed had committed a monstrous act of revenge. Elias had ridden with them for a time, a silent and detached observer, his mind replaying the clues he had found, the ledger, the journal, the bizarre conversation with Heatherton. He was a man apart, his own investigation a quiet rebellion against the posse's certainty. The landscape was a blur of harsh scrubland and sun-baked earth, each mile indistinguishable from the last. They were a dozen men with rifles and a shared, simplified narrative of good and evil. They found a few signs, a broken branch, a disturbed patch of grass, that they interpreted as a fleeing man. But Elias, with his newly awakened sense of doubt, saw them as nothing more than the random signs of a harsh land. On the afternoon of the 4th day, a scout rode back, his face grim with excitement. "We found him, or at least we found his tracks leading to an old shack. Looks like he's holed up." The posse cheered, a grim, bloodthirsty sound that sent a chill down Elias's spine. They spurred their horses, a frantic race to deliver their own brand of justice. Elias, with a feeling of deep dread, followed at a distance. He had to be there. He had to see. He had a terrible premonition that they were wrong. The shack was a dilapidated structure, a ruin of rotten wood and rusted tin. It was isolated, a place no sane man would seek refuge. They surrounded it, rifles at the ready. Jedediah Price, the sheriff, called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Samuel, come out with your hands up. We know you're in there." Silence. Jedediah motioned to two of his men. They kicked in the door with a loud splintering sound. They went in cautiously, their rifles raised. A moment later, a triumphant cry went up. "He's here! We got him!" The posse stormed the shack. Elias dismounted and walked slowly toward the chaos. He pushed his way through the crowd of men and peered inside. Lying on the dirt floor, his hands and feet bound with rope, was a man. He was dark-skinned, his face swollen and bruised. But it wasn't Samuel. It was a younger man, a stranger. His eyes, wide with terror and a deep, raw confusion, were fixed on Elias. The man was a decoy. Elias felt a wave of nausea. He knelt down, his eyes meeting the man's. The man was gagged, his mouth stuffed with a piece of cloth. Elias noticed the rope. It wasn't a noose, it was a piece of cheap twine. A desperate, last-minute act. "He ain't Samuel," one of the posse members said, his voice laced with disappointment. "Who is he?" "He's a ghost," another man said, his face a mixture of fear and confusion. "He was meant to look like Samuel, but he ain't." Jedediah, with a single, brutal kick, removed the gag. The man coughed, a painful, hacking sound. I'm not him," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He took me from my farm, told me he'd pay me to be his guide. He took my horse and left me here." Elias felt a cold dread settle in his bones. The killer was still out there, and he was toying with them. This was another clue, another piece of the puzzle. The killer had not only set them on a false trail, he had a plan for the decoy as well. He had an alibi, but why? Elias looked at the man's hands. They were clean, uncalloused. This was not a man who had tilled the land. He wasn't a rancher. He wasn't a slave. He was a pawn. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out from the brush. The man on the ground, the decoy, convulsed. A bright red stain blooming on his chest. A single shot. A clean kill. The posse members scattered, their rifles raised, searching for the shooter. But the shooter was gone, a silent phantom in the desolate landscape. Elias stared at the dying man, his eyes wide with horror. The posse's quarry had just become a victim. The killer, the mastermind, had just proven a point. He was one step ahead. He knew what they would do. He knew they would find the decoy. He knew they would believe he was Samuel. And he had a plan for that, too. The posse, in a fit of rage, began to argue, blaming each other for the mistake. Jedediah, his face pale, turned to Elias. "You were right, boy. This ain't no simple act of vengeance. This is a game." Elias looked at the dead man, then at the posse. Their search for justice had just led to another man's death. They were no longer the law. They were pawns in a twisted game. The killer was not just a murderer. He was a puppeteer, pulling their strings, setting them on a course of destruction. He had to get to the Marrowick homestead. He had to find what he had missed. The tilled earth, the missing boots, the ledger, the journal, the symbol. They were all pieces of a larger, more sinister puzzle. The killer had left a trail for him, and him alone. And now, with the death of the decoy, Elias knew he was in a race against time. The killer was not just taunting him. He was daring him to find the truth, to prove him wrong. And with every step he took, Elias felt the chilling realization that the killer was not just a man seeking vengeance, but a person with a plan so meticulous, so intricate, that it bordered on madness. Elias rode back to the Marrowick homestead, leaving the stunned and frustrated posse behind. The murder of the decoy had shaken them, their simple-minded hunt for a runaway slave now a tangled knot of confusion and shame. Elias, however, felt a cold, determined resolve. The killer's actions had stripped away all doubt. He was not looking for a man driven to a desperate act, but a cold, calculating mind. A mind that had orchestrated every detail, from the grotesque hanging to the death of a decoy. Back at the cabin, The oppressive silence was no longer that of death, but of a waiting presence. The air seemed to hum with a quiet tension, as if the secrets of the house were a living, breathing entity. Elias went straight to the tilled patch of earth in the garden. He had found the journal and the locket, but he felt an undeniable pull to the spot. He was a man who worked the land, and he knew that earth, once turned, held a memory. He began to dig, not with frantic, searching hands, but with a slow, deliberate purpose, as if unearthing the very sins of his family. He hit something hard, a large flat stone. It was a cover, a perfect fit for a small, hidden cellar, a place that had been sealed off for years. Elias, with a surge of adrenaline, found a crowbar in the barn and pried the stone up, revealing a dark, musty hole. He lit his lantern and descended the crude wooden steps, the air growing colder and damper with each step. The cellar was small, a cramped, subterranean tomb. It was filled with old trunks and forgotten relics. He opened one, a heavy wooden chest, and found a cache of old correspondence, letters exchanged between Silas and their father, long before Elias was born. The letters painted a picture of a young, ambitious Silas, a man who would do anything to acquire land and power. There were letters about a land deal that had gone sour, a debt their father had incurred to a family he had wronged, a family with 2 young sons, one of whom Silas had promised to take care of in exchange for the debt's forgiveness. Elias's hands trembled as he read the name, McPherson. He opened another trunk. Inside he found a collection of children's toys, relics from a time before the cruelty had taken root. And then he saw it, a stack of drawings. They were of a boy, a young man in various stages of life. They were all meticulously detailed, portraits drawn from memory. The young man's face was a stranger to him, but the eyes were familiar. They were sharp, intelligent, and filled with a deep, unsettling sadness, the kind of eyes that could hold a grudge for a lifetime. Elias knelt, the lantern light dancing on the drawings, and a new, chilling realization dawned on him. The drawings weren't of just any young man. They were of a young man who had once been on the property, a young man who had interacted with Silas and his family, a young man who had, for a time, been considered a part of the family, a part of the debt, a young man with a powerful intellect. The artist was good. The artist was meticulous. The artist had a plan. The last drawing in the stack was a detailed architectural blueprint of the Marrowick homestead. It was old, but the details were impeccable. A drawing of the house, the barn, the slave quarters, the well, and the old disused cellar in the garden. A place only an intimate would know about. The drawing had the initials A.H. scrawled in the corner. The letters, the drawings, the cellar, the tilled earth. The pieces of the puzzle were no longer just fragments. They were a complete picture, a terrifying mosaic of long, simmering revenge. Alistair Heatherton wasn't just a financier. He was the McPherson son. He had changed his name, moved to Dallas, and built a new identity, a new life, all for one purpose, to bring down Silas Marrowick. Elias felt a cold, helpless despair. He had been looking for a man, a physical killer, but he was hunting a plan. The McPherson sons, driven by their father's injustice, had spent years, perhaps decades, meticulously planning Silas's demise. They had watched him, learned his weaknesses, and then, with cold, surgical precision, they had begun their work. They had manipulated a man of great wealth and power, drawing him into a web of debt he could never escape. They had used his own greed against him, and when the time came, they had used his own cruelties as their final weapon. The hanging was not an act of rage. It was a final, theatrical flourish, a signature that no one would understand, a warning to all who had wronged them. And they had used Samuel as their final, cruel masterstroke, a living alibi for a crime no one would ever believe was anything but a simple act of a wronged man. They wanted the world to think Silas had gotten what he deserved, and they had wanted Elias to see the true depths of his family's sins. The boots, the new rope, the carving, they were all breadcrumbs, a trail left not for the law but for Elias. They wanted him to see the truth. Elias had to get out of the cellar. He had to find Samuel and warn him. The killer had framed him, and now he was a living time bomb, a final piece of the puzzle that was about to be obliterated by the angry posse. He had to find him, but where? Then he noticed something in the dust on the floor of the cellar. A single fresh boot print, a large one. A man's print. Someone else had been in the cellar, and recently. Alistair Heatherton, the man with the plan, the man whose face he had just seen in the drawings, had been here. He was not just pulling the strings. He was a silent, lethal presence. Elias was not just in a race against the posse, he was in a race against the killer, a race to find Samuel before he became the final victim in a long-planned, brutal act of revenge. With the horrifying truth of the ledger and the drawing still rattling in his head, Elias fled the Marrowick homestead. The silence of the place, once a chilling absence, now felt like a living thing, a conspiracy of the land itself. The boot print in the cellar floor was the final, terrifying piece of the puzzle. Alistair Heatherton, the Macpherson son, was not a ghost from the past. He was a current, lethal presence, a spider who had returned to his web to see his final act play out. Elias had to find Samuel. He was the key. He was the one person who could confirm what Elias now knew. He rode toward the old Miller farm, a place Silas had sold Eliza and her son. The Millers were known to be brutal, and Elias felt a pang of guilt for never intervening. He had kept his distance from Silas's cruelties, a quiet bystander, and now he realized the price of that detachment. The Miller homestead was a mirror of the Marrowicks, but a more sinister one. The yard was littered with broken tools, and the air was thick with the scent of unwashed animals. Elias dismounted and walked to the small, dilapidated cabin. A woman, her face a roadmap of exhaustion and hardship, emerged. Her name was Eliza. Elias, with a new sense of humility, introduced himself. "My name is Elias Marrowick. I need your help, Eliza. It's about Samuel." Eliza's face, a mask of weary resignation, hardened. "A Marrowick. What do you want? Haven't your kind taken enough?" Her voice was a low, bitter rasp. "I know what my brother did," Elias said, his voice raw with shame. "I know he sold you and your son. I am here because I believe Samuel is innocent. I believe he was framed by the very man who wronged your family too." Eliza looked at him, a flicker of something new, cautious curiosity in her eyes. "Framed? By who?" Elias explained everything, the ledger, the journal, the drawings, and the name of Alistair Heatherton, the son of Callum Macpherson. He spoke with a feverish urgency, laying bare his family's sins and his own complicity in their long reign of cruelty. Eliza listened in silence, her expression a mix of disbelief and a growing, cold understanding. "Macpherson," she whispered. "He had a grudge. Everyone knew that, but this, a revenge that takes years to ripen, that is a kind of evil only a madman could possess." "He is a madman," Elias said, "but he is also a genius. He has planned every detail. He framed Samuel knowing the posse would go after him. He wanted the law to do his dirty work, to tie up the loose ends. Samuel is the final piece of his plan, the final act in his twisted play." Eliza looked at him, her eyes fixed on his. "Why should I help you? You're a Marrowick. You stood by while he ruined my life." "Because," Elias said, his voice pleading, "I am not him, and because Samuel is an innocent man. He is a good man. He deserves better than a hanging at the hands of a mob. He deserves justice." Eliza was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the horizon. A deep, soulful sadness filled her eyes. "My son," she said, her voice a low, painful whisper. "He had an old friend, a boy his age. He was a runaway, a free black man from the East. He taught my son to read, to write. They had a secret hiding place, a place he would go to if he was ever in trouble, a small cave up near the river. Samuel knew about it. He told me about it once." Elias felt a surge of hope, a place, a lead. He looked at Eliza, his heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and shame. She had every reason to turn him away, to let the Marrowick name consume itself. But she hadn't. "Thank you, Eliza," he said. "Go," she said, her voice flat. "And if you find him, tell him the Millers. They're getting what they deserve. He doesn't need to worry about us anymore." Elias rode out with a new sense of purpose. He was no longer just chasing a ghost. He was chasing a killer who had a living, breathing conscience. He was no longer just searching for a killer. He was an accomplice in an act of justice. He was going to find Samuel, and he was going to expose the truth, even if it meant destroying the last remaining piece of the Marrowick name. He was no longer just a man running from his past. He was a man running toward a final, brutal reckoning. The cave was a small, unassuming fissure in the rocky face of a cliff near the river. It was well hidden, a secret known only to a few. Elias dismounted and approached with caution, his hand on his holstered revolver. He called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Samuel, it's Elias. I've come to help you." There was a long silence, and then a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Samuel, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. He held a small, weathered Bible in his hand. "Master Elias," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "I knew you would come. I knew you would not be blinded by their lies." Elias felt a surge of relief. He had found him. He explained everything, the ledger, the journal, the plan, and the identity of the McPherson sons. He told Samuel about the decoy, the second murder, and the chilling realization that the killer was still out there, orchestrating the final act. Samuel listened in silence, his eyes fixed on Elias's face, a slow understanding dawning on him. "I knew it," he said, his voice filled with a terrible, quiet grief. "I knew this was not an act of a simple man. It was a man driven by a long, cold hatred." He looked at Elias, a new look of respect in his eyes. "You have seen the truth, Master Elias. You have seen what I have seen for years, the wickedness of your brother's heart." "But how?" Elias asked, his voice a low murmur. "How did he do it? How did he manipulate you, me, the posse?" Samuel shook his head. "He didn't manipulate me. He came to me in secret. He told me of his plans. He told me he was going to expose Silas for the monster he was. He showed me the ledger. He told me about the land, the boy who was sold with his mother. He told me he was going to burn the whole thing down, but that he would make sure I was free. He gave me a choice. I could run, and they would frame me for the murders, or I could stay, and they would kill me too." Elias felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The killer hadn't manipulated Samuel. He had offered him a choice, freedom or death, a twisted, impossible choice. "But the note," Elias said, his voice hoarse, "the word on the floor, it was your name. He left it there to frame you." "I didn't write it," Samuel said. "He wrote it. He wrote it in front of me, after the deed was done. He showed me the note, told me what would happen if I didn't run. He had it all planned. He knew you would find it. He knew the posse would follow it. He wanted to make sure there were no loose ends." Elias felt the air leave his lungs. The full, terrifying scope of the plan was laid bare before him. The killer had left clues for him to find. The ledger, the journal, the drawings, the second victim. He had wanted Elias to see the truth, to understand the full weight of his family's crimes, to witness their final brutal reckoning. He had wanted Elias to be the one to expose it, to be the messenger of his long-awaited justice. Suddenly, a voice rang out from behind them. "Well, well, well, look what we have here. The prodigal son and the runaway slave, a touching reunion." Elias spun around, his hand going for his gun. Standing at the entrance to the cave, a calm, malevolent smile on his face, was a man Elias had never seen before. A man with sharp, intelligent eyes, a neatly trimmed beard, and a rifle in his hands. Alistair Heatherton. "So," Heatherton said, his eyes fixed on Elias, "you are smarter than I gave you credit for, Elias. You saw the truth. You saw the web of lies and deceit that your brother wove. You saw the blood on your family's hands." He raised his rifle, his finger on the trigger. But it doesn't matter. The story is already written. Samuel is the killer. The posse will find his body here, and the case will be closed. It will be a final, fitting end to a long, ugly story. "You won't get away with this," Elias said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "I know what you did. I know about your family. I know about the ledger, the land. I know about everything." Heatherton chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. "You know? And who will you tell? The posse. They already have their minds made up. They will just see a man, a Marrowick, defending a slave, and they will see a man, a McPherson, with a gun." He motioned with the rifle. "Go on, Elias. Tell them. Tell them your family was built on a lie. Tell them the truth. They will just call you a madman, and they will kill Samuel, and they will go home, and they will sleep soundly, believing they have done the right thing." Elias stared into the man's cold, calculating eyes. He had lost. He had solved the mystery, but the killer had already won. He had set a trap so perfect, so intricate, that there was no way out. The truth was his alone to bear, a final, terrible burden. And as Heatherton's finger tightened on the trigger, Elias knew that the Marrowick family had finally, completely come to its own terrible end. A shot rang out, a sharp, deafening crack that shattered the stillness. But it was not Heatherton's gun. A figure emerged from the brush, a tall, silent figure with a rifle. It was Jacob, Samuel's younger brother. He had been following Elias and Samuel, a silent guardian in the shadows. He had seen the entire scene unfold. Heatherton, caught off guard, stumbled back, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and rage. Jacob raised his rifle again, his eyes fixed on Heatherton, his finger on the trigger. "You won't kill him," Heatherton said, his voice a low hiss. "You're a slave. You won't kill a white man. You're not one of us." "I am not a slave," Jacob said, his voice quiet but firm. "I am a free man, and you, sir, are a monster." Heatherton, seeing his final act of vengeance slipping away, made a desperate lunge for his gun. But before he could get a hand on it, a bullet from Jacob's rifle found its mark. Heatherton fell, a final bitter gasp of air escaping his lips. Elias and Samuel stared in stunned silence. The puppet master, the man who had orchestrated the entire gruesome affair, was dead. The silence returned, this time a final, profound one. Samuel knelt, a single tear running down his weathered face. "He took my life. He took my master's life. And now he has taken his own." The three of them walked back to the Marrowick homestead in silence, the night air thick with the weight of what had just happened. They knew what they had to do. They had to tell the story, the truth, no matter how ugly. They found Jedediah Price and the posse still reeling from the events of the day. Elias, with a newfound courage, laid it all out. He showed them the ledger, the journal, and the drawings from the cellar. He told them about Alistair Heatherton, the man who had meticulously planned his revenge for decades, using Silas's own wickedness as his weapon. He told them about Samuel's part in the plot, a pawn in a cruel game of manipulation. The posse listened in stunned silence, their faces a mixture of disbelief and a growing, painful understanding. The simple narrative they had clung to, the idea of a simple black and white world, was gone, replaced by a grey, complex and deeply unsettling reality. They had almost killed an innocent man, all for a lie. The town, when the story was finally told, was in an uproar. Some believed Elias. Others, clinging to their prejudice, called him a liar, a man who would do anything to protect his family's name. But the evidence was there, undeniable and damning. The ledger, the journal, the drawings. The McPherson family, long forgotten, now returned as a ghost to haunt the community. Samuel, with the help of Eliza and Jacob, was finally truly free. He chose to leave the town, a place that held too many bitter memories. He left with his brother, a new life waiting for him in the vast, unforgiving frontier. Elias, the last of the Marrowicks, stayed behind. He had found a new purpose. He sold the Marrowick homestead, the land he had inherited, and gave the money to Eliza and the other families his brother had wronged. He had to atone for his family's sins. He had to make things right. The Marrowick name, once a symbol of power and wealth, was now a curse, a stain on the land. But for Elias, it was no longer a burden. It was a reminder of the terrible cost of indifference, the price of silence in the face of injustice. He had found his truth, and in doing so, he had found his own humanity. He knew that the world was not a simple place, that evil was not always easy to recognize, and that sometimes the greatest terror was not what lurks in the shadows, but what lies hidden in plain sight, in the heart of a man. The story of the Marrowick family was not a tale of a monstrous slave, but a quiet, chilling chronicle of a family's sins, and the terrible, patient vengeance that finally brought them to their knees. And in the end, it was a story of a single man who, by choosing to see the truth, saved himself from a fate far worse than death. The reckoning had come, and the price had finally been paid.